Hi, everybody. Great to be back. Great to see you. To my left is, of course, Tobias Wolff, and I'm just going to give a brief, very personal introduction to a writer whom I cherish, both as a person and as a writer. And I'll simply say this. If I were to say to my 15-year-old son, Garrick, to point out someone who to me exemplifies, if you were going to become a writer in the world, a serious, important writer, how to do that, how to carry yourself, how to nourish your work and the work of others, I would point him to Toby Wolff. And if you look at what Toby has managed to do with his life, both the life that came at him when he was young, which we will get into in a bit, and what he managed to do with that life, and how he managed to grow those experiences into stories, and to navigate himself and his craft, first through short stories, starting in 1981 with a fantastic collection, In the Garden of the North American Martyrs. I taught one of those stories in the late 80s at Harvard. And taking that form, extending it, learning how to harness the power, the precision, the velocity of those stories, working with certain themes that seemed, I guess, indelible in his own life, themes of deception, if you will, the fragility of good fortune, the moral quandaries of being alive, and working with that form to make the very most of those themes, and using language that was never showy, but always multi-layered and deeply effective for the story at hand. And then coming to certain periods of his life and deciding, because that's what the stories told him, to write memoir. And he wrote This Boy's Life, came out in 1989. I'm sure you know of it. And he followed that with In Pharoah's Army some years later, which picks up really the narrative of his time in Vietnam and training as a soldier. And we'll get into all of that. But those memoirs stand as classics. His short story writing, he's won every major award for short fiction there is, the Ray Prize, the Story Prize, and he is now at work closing in on a novel. So there's no form that he has bowed away from. He's been teaching. He's taught for many years. He's a much beloved teacher, and among his students are George Saunders and Tom Pharoah and many other great writers. And the way he's carried himself, his generosity, his humility, and his fierce desire to forever get better at what he does. So, you need look no further than Toby as what a writer should be. So it's my great honor and privilege to be here with my friend. And we're going to just have a conversation, really, about his life and his work and his thoughts on fiction and other writers, because we all stand on the shoulders. And, to begin, and at the risk of overstructuring the narrative here, which is something that neither of us would appreciate, but I thought we might begin with your childhood, your past. And you know, you've said that, like most writers, you remember your past in stories, as a series of stories. And you've written some of those indelible stories, both in fiction and in memoir. And you've also said once that you said memory doesn't work by committee. And I just wondering what you meant by that, and as a sort of opening before we head back into the waters.
Good question. And thank you for inviting me here, John. It's lovely. It's my first time in Sun Valley, and I've enjoyed so much, you know, the people I've met here, the seriousness about writing that I've encountered here. And during his talk, George Packer said that nations, like people, need a story, and that really struck me forcibly. It's very true. We come to know ourselves and even define ourselves by the story and stories that we tell about ourselves, that we decide is our story, and that's a lifelong process. And it when you think of what happens when you tell a story about yourself, we live in this constant current of experience. We can't make all of it mean anything, so we have to find or impose some pattern on it to make sense of it. And so we are all storytellers in that way. Every time a kid comes home from school and starts telling you about his unfair victimization by his teacher, he's telling a story. You also know, as his parent, that he's leaving a lot out, and we do that. I mean, the very process of making a story means carving out, leaving out all kinds of things, editing our experience. So a story is always a very partial, gives us a partial sense of reality, but it's the only way we can have any sense of reality is to give our experience form.
And different people within the story see it in very different ways, of course.
Boy, do they ever.
That story, that scene from Shakespeare in Love?
Oh, yeah.
You remember that? Well,
oh, yeah. It's the wench, the actors have gone into a pub during rehearsal. You'll remember all this, I know, but this big guy who's playing the nurse, Juliet's nurse, because there was always guys on the stage in Shakespeare's time. He's sitting down having a flagon beside this woman who's working in the pub, and said, she says, so you're in a play. What's it called? Romeo and Juliet. And she says, what's the play about? And he says, well, there's this nurse. And it's such a great line.
We're all our own protagonists. I mean,
it is just wonderful.
You know, you've written memoirs now, and you know very well that you may think it's your memoir,
Absolutely.
But other people might think it's theirs. So, but let's go back to your childhood, because you certainly packed a lot in, and the family's structural dynamic of your childhood had some very interesting wrinkles to it. Mm-hmm. Would you explain, just for the crowd, to sort of lay the baseline here of what those structural dynamics were for you, where you were living and how you were, you know, with your mom and with your brother Jeffrey and his father, and where you spent your time, and what was the, as you look back, what was the sort of arc of that, of
right.
those years, just kind of practically speaking?
Right. Well, there were four of us. I have my parents, of course, and I have an older brother, Jeffrey Wolff, also a writer and a wonderful
writer.
And our father was absent a lot, and he was he did different kinds of projects as a aeronautical engineer, very much an autodidact. He was actually involved to some extent in the design of the P-51 Mustang, the plane, they say, that won the war. But he was also pretty, how can I put it, unreliable.
I did hear him described as a genteel con man.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Someone looking at him from the outside would probably think he was a con man. But he always believed his own BS. So that doesn't count, really, does it? The true con man knows he's conning somebody, right?
Right.
But when my father, for example, would go into a Jaguar dealer and drive an XK120, which he did, off the lot, I know that he really meant to pay for that someday. But in the end, all his cars got repossessed, and he manufactured the one way in which he was, I think, consciously deceptive, though even that became unconscious after a time, was concealing his origins, even his real name. And it was strange. He grew up in a very, very cultured Jewish family in Hartford, Connecticut. His father was a doctor, as his father had been a doctor, and his father before him, going back a very long time. One of them had been a doctor on Napoleon's staff. And but he was an only child, born very late in his parents' life, and they were really unable to keep up with him, and he got way out of hand. They sent him off to boarding school, and this was at a time when I not just in Europe but in this country too, anti-Semitism was hardly concealed, really, and especially in boarding schools, I think. And so he adopted the manner and genealogy of a patrician, and took on the manner of one. And that, in a way, that first kind of entering into another role tainted his whole life and his relation to others. So he was, mostly absent in my childhood. My mother drove us across country first to Utah, then to Washington State, just the two of us, and ended up marrying a man in Washington State. And we lived in the Cascade Mountains in a little tiny village up in the mountains that was a kind of service village for a dam up there for Seattle City Light, and traveled 35 miles a day each way to go to high school when I finally started. And so that was it was a.
And Jeffrey, who was 7 years older, right? He went off to live with Duke.
Yeah, he lived
father in another life completely.
Right.
And Jeffrey would publish his memoir, which is wonderful, The Duke of Deception, about life with his and Toby's father in the late 70s, about 10 years before Toby published This Boy's Life, about really life with your mother and your stepfather. So This Boy's Life, if you haven't read it, it really is one of the very best memoirs I can think of. And to me, that you're the protagonist, but it's about your mother, really, above all.
Right.
And I would love you just to talk a little bit about how you came to write that book as memoir and what your thoughts were about it, which are really thoughts about your mother.
Yeah.
And and how you remembered her.
Right. Well, I had a lot of adventures with my mother when we were growing up, because I grew up with her. She was from a Irish Catholic family, and a wanderer, even to the end. When she was in her 80s, she broached the idea to me of her by herself buying a Winnebago and taking off across the country again. And I discouraged her from this, and I sort of wish I hadn't now. The very fact that she wanted to do that tells you a lot about her. Once she got on an airplane, almost not exactly on a whim, but just about on a whim, and flew to North Africa, and met a guy on the airplane who was a famous architect who was going to take an architectural tour by himself in a Jeep through the Atlas Mountains to see how people had fashioned their houses over the millennia, really, up there. And invited, it wasn't a romance. He just liked her and said, "You want to come along?" So she gets into a Jeep with this guy that she's met on an airplane and spends 2 weeks driving through the Atlas Mountains. That was my mother. And I had started to write a couple of stories to kind of calling those years back, and they kind of fell flat as fiction. And I thought, well, this thing wants to be written as the real experience that I had with her. And so when I finally admitted to myself that I was writing a memoir, which was not an easy thing to admit to myself, because you feel very exposed in the writing of a book like that, and I was not a role model. And I had 2 boys at the time I was writing that. I thought, oh boy, what are they going to think of me if I actually tell the truth about myself? And there's no other reason to write such a book except to do that. But anyway, they turned out to be very understanding in the end. And it had in exposing myself as the miscreant boy I often was, it did discourage me then in raising my sons from putting on the judge's robes that we so often do when raising our children, and the robes of righteousness, and when I was your age, and then fill it in. It was always some good thing follows that phrase, some wonderfulness of your own. So it turned out to be kind of a tonic in our relationship.
Well, again, I think reaching a point in one's life where almost without realizing it, the surface may seem very different from the past that has preceded it, so that people looking at one's life might see something, and then you start saying, well, no, actually, that's not what I came from.
That's
there's a story I know you told. I don't want to make more of it maybe than it was, but a colleague when you were teaching at Syracuse came to dinner, someone you didn't know that well, and kind of made a few well-intentioned assumptions about your nice house, because everything was very domestic and lovely, and assuming that you had come from that through the world of private schools and a certain kind of, and after he left, you're kind of bothered by it, because that's not what you'd come from.
Right.
And then by that time, your mother had gone from roving the world and being one of the most adventurous women in contemporary letters, I would say, to being, I don't know, the president of some incredible Rotary Club,
League of Women Voters in Volusia County, Florida.
Absolutely.
Secretary of the Garden Club.
And so you set about not dismantling that, but building it again from inside. And
that's right. It was in a funny way, without him meaning to have been provocative. It did provoke in me the desire to say, well, one might easily assume the kinds of things that he did, and But it would be a nice thing to have a record of how things actually were,
Right.
at least for my children, if for nothing else.
So, not the record, of course, a true record is both light and dark. And within this boy's life, as anyone who's read it will know, or seen the movie as well with De Niro and Leo DiCaprio, there's a very dark strain, which is your mother's marriage to Dwight, and a very abusive man. And one of the overriding questions, in a way, that comes from that, I think, is the hatred that ultimately it fills you with towards him, and as you've described it, kind of disfigures you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested to think about how you've carried that weight, how you carried that weight forward with you after Dwight was gone, and both as a person and as a writer. What do you do with that as a writer?
This man my mother was married to was a violent man. He was alcoholic, and once even followed after my mother left him and went to Washington, D.C. to work, followed her out and tried to kill her with a knife on her way home. So this was a pretty bad guy. Actually, I rarely think about him anymore. I thought about him a lot. Writing, I don't write for therapy. I'd rather really pay a professional. Writing's too hard. Writing, it puts me in therapy. But I have to say that probably writing the book, having to step out of the experience, see it from outside, form it, shape it, give it language, and that was a tremendously freeing thing for me. So that's not why I did it, but
No.
it did have, I think, that effect on me. I don't think about him. I don't carry that at all anymore. I did have he had children who were my step siblings, and one of my step siblings called me up, and she was a little cross with me about the book. Not that she disputed it, but she said, "I just want you to know," she said, "that when my dad was dying," she said, "I had my daughter read your book to him, and it really made him unhappy in his last days." And I thought, couldn't you have have had her read him like Black Beauty or something like that? I was really, kids say the darndest things. There's just a lot of books out there you could have read to him.
She may have had her own anger, George Dwight. So that relationship passed, and your description of the last time you ever saw Dwight, as he's being arrested.
That was the last time I saw him as the police came. Yeah.
And so part of that, the wild journey of this boy's life as well, and it taps into a novel, wonderful novel that Toby wrote some years later called Old School, which I'm incredibly partial to, is that at the age of 14, much to our surprise, much to everybody's surprise as it turns out, Toby finds himself with a big scholarship at a prestigious boarding school on Philadelphia's main line called the Hill School, registered as a student under the very impressive name of Tobias Jonathan von Ansel Wolff III. And so I'm
my father's son.
So this is the part where we start getting into the real story-making mode, where life starts meeting fiction and the future fiction maker. And I'm wondering, looking back, first, if you wouldn't mind just explaining how the hell that happened, and two, how you see that now in relation to the fiction writer and storyteller you became. Not to put too direct a line to it.
Right.
Unless you'd rather not.
Well, I'll just briefly do it. And things had reached such a point in my life with my stepfather that I really felt I had to get out. And so I managed to get in touch with my brother, who I had not been in touch with for many years, who was then in his last year at Princeton, and said, you know, can you help? Can you give me some advice here? He said, well, how about trying to get you a scholarship to a boarding school? And he had gone to one himself, and it had been a great help to him. And he said, he said, are you doing really well in school? And I lied and said yes. And he said, well, then let's get on this and see what we can do. So he told me, he gave me a list of schools to apply to, and I realized that, in fact, I had really been in trouble a lot. I skipped school a lot. That the actual Toby Wolff was not going to get a scholarship to one of these schools, so I had to come up with another Toby Wolff that would. And so a friend of mine, Gary, was working in the office of the high school that I was in, Concrete High School it was called, and it was, as I said, 35 miles from the village where I lived. So we had this long bus ride every day. And Gary filched me a bunch of Concrete High School stationery. And after school, each day for a couple of weeks, I went into the typing lab after school when there was nobody there, and I wrote myself some really glowing letters of recommendation. And I also, again, with some help from my friend, who was then my best friend, altered my transcripts. And in that way, I took a scholarship away from some boy who actually deserved it. And I'm not proud of that. But I'm glad that I ended up getting to this school, the Hill School, because it was a tremendous, just a revolution in my life. The education I got there just was extraordinary, and the kind of intellectual ferment that I experienced there, unlike anything that I'd ever known. The encouragement toward a life of thinking and thinking critically about things. It was it was an experience that really gave me a way forward that I had not seen before. So,
did you feel, was that the time when the idea of becoming a writer or first began to take hold, and who were the writers that that really began?
Right. Absolutely. It was actually, I had always written. For some reason, I had always been attracted to reading and even trying writing stories myself. Of course, very imitative stories. I loved O. Henry and liked to write stories with trick endings, that sort of thing. I remember one of them, in fact. It was a story about a family of Italian acrobats, and the patriarch is really a nasty guy, and so his wife and kids, the finale is that he gets way up on the trapeze and does a dive into a pool of water down below, and before the show they drain the tank and paint it blue, and take out a big insurance policy. That was the trick ending. Anyway, that's one of the stories the kind of stories that I wrote. But no, I loved writing, and then I spent a summer with my brother before I went off to school, and he had been an English major at Princeton and really encouraged me in this a lot, and actually kind of educated me, prepared me for school that summer. He had me reading Greek plays and Hemingway's stories, and that became especially. He really focused on Hemingway toward the end of the summer when Hemingway died that summer, killed himself that summer, and my brother was just devastated by that and really wanted me to learn about Hemingway and took me through his stories. And so I had great encouragement from him and then from several of my teachers at school.
By the way, if you haven't seen the Ken Burns Hemingway, two-part Hemingway documentary, you'll see Toby in there talking with incredible wisdom and clarity, I think, about Hemingway's work. So you came from, been growing up mostly out in the Pacific Northwest in a more of a working class environment. You have a couple of years at the Hill School, which is total flip-flop in a sense, and yet at the same time, that and being with Jeffrey that summer gives you an insight and a platform into a very different kind of world, an intellectually based world, and then you end up enlisting in the Army,
right?
1964, where you'll spend 4 years,
right?
And so, where you'll end up spending much of that time more with people like whom you came from, although you might be quite different now in certain ways. So I'm wondering what was going through your mind then as you enlisted, and then over those years. This is what you write so well about in Pharoah's Army. And was there, I mean, a number of the writers you admired had also had military experiences. It was that sort of time. On the other hand, then you still have to go live it.
Yeah.
And then later on, when you're writing about it, how is writing about being a soldier, how do you handle that tone as opposed to writing about your own childhood?
Right.
So it's a series of questions, I guess.
Right. Well, in my last year at this school, I was derelict in studying mathematics, which I failed repeatedly and lost my scholarship, so I had to leave. And worked on a ship for a while, a Coast and Geodetic Survey ship, and then I joined the Army. Seemed a very natural thing for me to do, because all the men that I had grown up with had served, and it was just seemed to me to be something you did, and like a base you touched in life. So I went in and in an odd way found it congenial. The order of it, never had to, talk about going into the Army to become a man. No, you go into the Army to stay a boy. You never have to make a decision about what you're going to wear. You never have to look for a place to live. You never have to worry about cooking your own meals. No, it's a prolonged adolescence, really, and in that way maybe was congenial with the order, and I liked the physical challenge of it, and I had great friends.
But you went into the Green Berets, and so Vietnam is...
It was in my future.
Yeah.
It wasn't when I went into the Army in 1964. Vietnam was not an inevitability. There were, we had troops there. We had not lost very many of them, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that this was going to become the serious thing that it did. I mean, it was serious, but an all-consuming thing for the country. and but of course it did, and you know, eventually I realized that I had kind of got myself in a funnel that was leading to one place, and it did. So I was, I went to jump school, became a paratrooper, then I was at Fort Bragg in the Special Forces, and then they sent me to language school to learn Vietnamese for a year, and then, you know, after all that training and learning Vietnamese, I knew they weren't going to send me to Germany. So that's when that funnel I'm talking about. And so, yeah, I did a tour my last year in the Army there.
So then when you decide to start writing about that period in your life, and this brings the question, too, of why fiction for some stories and nonfiction for others.
Right.
And how did you come to decide to write a memoir about that experience? And then how do you find a tone commensurate with the seriousness of the experience you knew?
Right. That's a good question. I did write a couple of short stories set in Vietnam, also prematurely a very bad novel, which I don't even list among my publications. I detest it so much. When I was still a student, I wrote that. And that probably, you know, most first novels don't get published, and this shouldn't have either, but it did. But I was trying to process it, definitely. And I wrote a couple of, I thought, pretty good short stories. But I knew that I wasn't really capturing the experience in it. But it took me a long time. I got back in '68, and I finished my memoir of service in Vietnam in 1994. So that's a long time, 26 years between the time I got back and the time that memoir came out. And it did take me that long to kind of step back from it and let things sort out, and also to be able to tell it truthfully. Mm-hmm. I was close enough at different times, and you know, of course, I consulted the letters that I had written home while I was over there, and they were unreliable because I was always affecting a good cheer.
Pose.
I struck a pose in those letters so that people wouldn't worry about me and that sort of thing, and it was.
The first chapter of, I think it's called Thanksgiving Special, or
right.
of in Pharoah's Army, punctures that pose entirely. You know, from the beginning, it lets you know that's so. That story, I mean, was that your entree into that as a memoir? I mean, was that in fact when you knew that you could tell this straight, as it were?
Well, I decided, you know, to write. There was a memory I had that I wanted to write pretty much as it happened, and then I did write it as it happened. And just briefly, so we were out in the sticks, and because I spoke Vietnamese, I was with a Vietnamese unit and a couple of other American so-called advisors, and one of them had gotten one of these little tiny TV sets that we would watch sometimes. The Armed Forces Network would show things, and we all liked Bonanza. And Thanksgiving of '67, Bonanza was going to have this Thanksgiving special, and we decided it really didn't do Bonanza justice to watch it on this thing. So there was an American base some distance farther down the road, and I will say not a very safe road, but we decided to go down there and snag ourselves, because the Americans had so much stuff. And so long story short, one of the sergeants that I was serving with, and I was by then a first lieutenant, drove down this road, braving mines and ambushes in order to snag ourselves a decent television. And we stole one, a big one, stashed it in the back, and managed to make it out of the American Post. Got home in time to watch Bonanza on Thanksgiving. And that was the kind of crazy stuff that went on there. I mean, I think of it now. I think, what was I thinking? You know, you don't. But it was an upside down world. It really was.
So I want to leave time because we want to. I'd like to end with Toby reading from a novel that he is close to finishing, and he, as I said in the beginning, he's continued to write stories, and he's written these memoirs, but he's written some novels along the way, and he's come back to this now, and he's very private about what he writes, doesn't like to talk about it, so I can tell you that I know virtually nothing about the book itself, and except what he's going to tell us now. And I guess before we do that, wondering if the novel form itself was something that you wanted to investigate at this point, or whether it just this story particularly indicated to you that it needed greater length.
That's pretty much how I decide on the form. Is like when I was writing something that I thought was fiction, and I realized, no, this really needs to be told as memoir, and sometimes I'll start writing a story and I realize it can't and that was how this came about. I hope I'm finishing this novel pretty soon, and this is just a really short excerpt that I'm going to read tonight. The narrator is looking back at this point. He was an actor in plays in college at Berkeley, this narrator, and was in love with a girl. And but one night, after a triumphant performance, all the cast had a big party, and he ended up going home that night with a girl, not his girlfriend, and is racked with guilt the next day. And because he does love this woman, so
you want to use the podium, or you
sure,
here? It's
yeah,
up to you. Totally.
Yeah, I'll use the podium. As I say, this is quite brief. Okay. That evening, I went to Charlotte's room to confess. I recited the lines I'd prepared, but it was hardly necessary. Betrayal was written on my face, in my eyes, the movement of my hands, and I knew it. I could do nothing but watch Charlotte take it in and see how her mouth trembled and her own eyes went blind as she struggled to understand what she already knew could not be understood. For what reason could I have for spurning the gift she had made of herself once I had accepted it? She had not imagined I would ever do that. The man who would do that was not the man she had offered herself to. But who was he then? I fell mute, seeing the depth of the wound I had given her. I knew that nothing I said would reach her now. She was looking at me through a glaze of pain, with scouring, almost impersonal curiosity. It was worse than any reproach. Reproach would have been a relief. Yes, and anger and disgust. Then I understood that I had been counting on her to treat me like the fool I wanted to be taken for, to call me names, to throw things at me. I'd gone in to play a scene in a glib, whimsical movie, with myself as the bumbling rogue who'd wandered a bit off the straight and narrow, for which he's perfectly willing to take a few good bumps from a rolling pin and be sent to the doghouse. All, of course, with the understanding that my offense would thus be purged and myself forgiven, welcomed back into loving arms with even greater passion than before. A shallow, safe, conventional script, to be sure, but I already knew how to play it, and I hadn't thought deeply enough to come up with a better one. I was an actor, after all. I was also a Catholic, at least by well-honed instinct. For many years, the soul I no longer quite believed in had moved to the 4/4 rhythm of transgression, confession, penance, and absolution. Even in contemplating transgression, I had somehow allowed for all the steps to follow. The sheepish wait outside the confessional on Friday afternoon with the other boys, the subdued, murmurous voice I would use with the priest. Yes, Father, thank you, Father. Then the pressure of the kneeler on my shins as I worked through the prayers he'd assigned me, and at last the lightness of my step as I left the church and entered the world, already feeling a tingle of restlessness for the next adventure. And didn't my church love a sinner, after all? A lost sheep? The bigger the better, as long as he's sorry later. During the ceremony of infant baptism, we in the congregation are asked to renew our vows by rejecting the glamour of evil. But where did we get the idea that evil is glamorous? Who taught us that sin, though no doubt regrettable, is the prelude to forgiveness, to the celebration of a soul's rescue? That the worse the sin, the bigger the bash. Because isn't that our narrative? Before St. Paul was St. Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, ruthless persecutor of Christians. Knowing the dark, cruel history from which he turned, we hear in his prayers and exhortations an authority we wouldn't grant to some mama's boy who'd sung in the choir, never a drop took, and just couldn't understand why some folks did the things they did. Then there's St. Augustine with his stolen fruit and his mistress. Bunyan's pilgrim, whose journey to salvation would be pretty small beer if it didn't take him through the slough of despond, Vanity Fair, the doubting castle, and the valley of humiliation. Or John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. When he says, "a wretch like me," you know he's not just touching a rhetorical base. He'd been a wretch, all right, and then some, a captain of slave ships. And his hymn would not sound the same to us if we didn't know that. The redemption literature of our own day has introduced a new grating note, a tone of swaggering pride in having been such a bad boy or bad girl, with implied congratulations to God for having bagged such a trophy. At least the old wretches really knew they were wretches. Tax collectors, publicans, the prodigal son, the primum exemplum of selfish, lazy wastrels. He abandons his father and brother to all the farm work, blows his patrimony on booze and dice and fast women, and ends up sleeping with the pigs. He has second thoughts, naturally. So he writes home, "Boo-hoo," and of course his father says, "No problem, can't wait to see you." Father stands on a hill overlooking the road so he can see the first signs of his son's return and runs to meet him. Then throws a party in his honor, slaughters the fatted calf, the world-famous fatted calf, which we wouldn't even know about if he hadn't been slaughtered for the prodigal. Meanwhile, the hard-working brother, who's never had a party, is feeling the death of 1,000 cuts. And when he finally works up the nerve to say something, he's treated like a crybaby. Get over it, his father tells him. I see your mopey mug every day. What's to be excited about? But your brother, that's a different story. He had the gumption to get lost, and now he's found. Drink up. The lesson has not been lost on the rest of us. Who would you rather be? The grumbling drudge, the virtuous stay-at-home whose steadfastness makes him a bore to the very Father he serves? Or the high roller who sees the world from a red convertible, is on familiar terms with the wine steward, keeps amusing company, gets laid by showgirls, and then, after a few hunger pangs and a brief period of reflection on the error of his ways, comes home to a hero's welcome and veal piccata. This is all by way of saying that I went to Charlotte's room that night, not only to confess, but to be forgiven. I may even have nursed a hope of scoring points for honesty and for being desirable to other women, which would prove that I was with her out of choice rather than necessity. But at the very least, I would be forgiven. That was how it worked, in books, on stage and screen, in my mother's kitchen, in the walnut pews of St. Brendan's. I had never not been forgiven after confessing until this night. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
Tobias Wolff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Toby will be signing books up at the bookstore tent. We have lunch now for an hour and a half. Firuza Duma will have a breakout on writing memoir in tent B, and we will see you all back at 1:30 for breakouts, and onwards we go. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much.